I stood in the narrow hallway of my Capitol Hill apartment building, fumbling with the white cords that had somehow twisted themselves into an impossible knot overnight. The more I tried to untangle them, the tighter they seemed to become, like some cruel metaphor for my life. My fingers worked frantically at the plastic-coated wires, and I could feel that familiar heat rising in my chest, the same frustrated panic that hit me whenever simple things became complicated. The elevator dinged behind me, but I didn't turn around. I was too focused on this ridiculous problem, too embarrassed by my inability to handle something so basic. 29 years old, and I was defeated by headphone cables. Those look like they're giving you trouble. The voice was soft, measured, with a slight rasp that suggested someone who didn't speak often. I looked up to find a man standing near the elevator doors, holding them open with one hand. He was maybe 33, 34, with dark hair that looked like he'd been running his fingers through it, and eyes the color of Seattle's perpetually overcast sky. There was something gentle about his face, but also tired, the kind of tired that sleep doesn't fix. "Yeah," I said, my voice coming out smaller than I'd intended. "I think they're plotting against me." He smiled at that, a real smile that reached his eyes, and stepped out of the elevator. The doors closed behind him with a soft whoosh. "Mind if I take a look?" I'm pretty good with knots. I hesitated. In the 3 years I'd lived in this building, I'd managed to avoid meaningful interaction with most of my neighbors. It wasn't intentional cruelty. I just found it easier that way. Safer. But something about this man's presence felt different, non-threatening, like he understood the art of keeping to oneself. "I'm Finn," he said, extending his hand. 4B. "Liam," I replied, shaking it briefly. His palm was warm, slightly calloused. 3A. "Ah, the mysterious neighbor who plays piano at midnight." My face flushed. "You can hear that?" "I'm sorry, I didn't realize." "Don't apologize." Finn's expression softened. "It's beautiful. Sometimes I sit by my window just to listen." The admission hung between us, more intimate than it should have been. I found myself studying his face, noting the way his eyebrows drew together slightly when he concentrated, the small scar above his left temple, the way he held himself like someone who'd learned to take up less space in the world. "The headphones," he prompted gently. "Right." I held out the tangled mess, feeling foolish. "I don't know how they got like this. I just threw them in my bag yesterday after work and this morning." Finn took them from me, his fingers brushing mine for just a moment. The contact was electric, unexpected, and I had to resist the urge to pull my hand back. He began working at the knots with patient, methodical movements, and I found myself watching his hands, long fingers, neat nails, a thin silver ring on his right pinky. "You work in tech?" he asked, not looking up from his task. "Software development. How'd you know?" "The laptop bag." The slightly haunted expression of someone who spends too much time staring at screens. I laughed despite myself. "That obvious?" "Takes one to know one." He glanced up briefly, and I caught something in his eyes, a flicker of shared understanding. "Though I'm more on the research side. Marine biology." "That sounds fascinating." Finn shrugged, returning his attention to the headphones. "It can be. Lots of time on boats, studying things most people never think about. Sometimes I feel more comfortable underwater than I do on land." There was something wistful in his voice, a loneliness that I recognized because I carried the same weight. We were both quiet for a moment, the only sound the soft scratch of plastic against plastic as he worked at a particularly stubborn knot. "There," he said finally, holding up the untangled headphones. "Good as new. Thank you." I took them back, careful not to let our fingers touch again. The first contact had been unsettling enough, a reminder of how long it had been since I'd felt that kind of basic human connection. "I owe you one." It was nothing. Finn stepped back, creating distance between us. and I wondered if he'd felt it too, that moment of electricity, the weight of recognition. I should let you get to work. He moved toward the stairs, and I wanted to say something else, to extend this unexpected encounter somehow. But the words stuck in my throat, the same social paralysis that had kept me isolated for so long. "Finn!" I called out as he reached the stairwell door. He turned back, eyebrows raised in question. Maybe I could buy you coffee sometime, to say thank you?" The offer tumbled out before I could stop myself, and immediately I wanted to take it back. Too forward, too needy. He probably had a boyfriend, a life full of friends and obligations that didn't include awkward neighbors who couldn't manage basic tasks. But Finn's expression brightened, surprise giving way to something that looked like hope. "I'd like that," he said. "I'd like that a lot." The coffee shop on Pike Street was one of those places that tried too hard to be quirky. Mismatched furniture, local art covering every inch of wall space, and a chalkboard menu written in deliberately messy handwriting. But it was close to both our apartments, and when I'd texted Finn the address, he'd responded with enthusiasm that felt genuine rather than polite. I arrived first, claiming a small table near the window where I could watch the street and try to calm my nerves. It had been 3 days since our hallway encounter, 3 days of overthinking every aspect of our brief interaction. What if he'd only said yes to be polite? What if this was a mistake? The bell above the door chimed, and Finn appeared, scanning the crowded space until his eyes found mine. He was wearing a dark green sweater that brought out the color in his eyes, and his hair looked like he'd actually combed it this time. The sight of him sent an unexpected warmth through my chest. "Sorry I'm late," he said, sliding into the chair across from me. "Got caught up reading." "What were you reading?" "Research paper on coral bleaching." "Fascinating stuff, if you're into environmental catastrophe." His dry delivery made me smile. "Sounds cheerful." "I'm a ray of sunshine." Finn flagged down the barista, a young woman with purple hair and enough facial piercings to set off a metal detector. "What can I get you?" I ordered my usual, black coffee, no sugar, while Finn asked for something complicated involving oat milk and cinnamon. When the barista left, we sat in slightly awkward silence, both of us seeming to realize that we'd jumped from casual hallway encounter to coffee date without much in between. "So," Finn said finally, "how long have you lived in Seattle?" 5 years? You?" 6 months. Moved here from Austin for work? That's a big change." Finn nodded, his fingers drumming against the table. Sometimes change is necessary. There was weight behind the statement, the suggestion of a story he wasn't ready to tell. I recognized the feeling, the careful way you had to package your past when meeting new people, deciding which parts were safe to share and which needed to stay buried. Our drinks arrived, providing a welcome distraction. I watched Finn take his first sip, noting the way he closed his eyes briefly, as if savoring not just the coffee but the simple act of sitting somewhere warm and comfortable with another person. "Can I ask you something?" he said, setting down his mug. "Sure." "The piano playing. How long have you been doing that?" I felt my shoulders tense automatically. Music was personal, intimate in a way that made me uncomfortable when people noticed. "Since I was a kid. My mom insisted on lessons." "Do you play professionally?" "God, no. It's just something I do when I can't sleep." "Which is often." The question was gentle but perceptive. I found myself meeting his eyes, seeing understanding there rather than judgment. "Yeah, often." Finn nodded slowly. "I get that. I do my best thinking around 3 in the morning." "What do you think about?" "Everything. Nothing. The way sound travels differently underwater. Whether there's any point in studying ecosystems that might not exist in 50 years. He paused, then added quietly, "Why it's easier to be alone than to risk letting someone close." The admission hit me like a physical blow, not because it was shocking, but because it was so perfectly painfully familiar. I stared at him across the small table, this man who was essentially a stranger but who seemed to understand the exact shape of my loneliness. "Yeah," I said softly. "I think about that too." We sat in silence for a while, watching the world move past the window. Pike Street was busy even on a Thursday afternoon. Tourists heading to the market, locals hurrying between appointments, the usual mix of artists and tech workers that made Capitol Hill feel both bohemian and gentrified. But inside the coffee shop, it felt like we were in our own small bubble, protected from the chaos outside. "What made you leave Austin?" I asked eventually. Finn's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. "Work opportunity. And sometimes you need to put distance between yourself and your mistakes." "Mistakes?" "Poor judgment in relationships, mostly." He met my eyes briefly, then looked away. I have a tendency to ignore red flags until they're burning the house down around me. I knew that feeling too, though my own relationship disasters felt too raw to discuss with someone I'd just met. Instead, I said, "Seattle's a good place for fresh starts." "Is that what you're doing here?" "Fresh start?" "Something like that." Finn leaned back in his chair, studying me with an intensity that made me want to squirm. "You don't talk about yourself much, do you?" "Neither do you." "Touché." He smiled, and I felt something loosen in my chest. "Maybe we can work on that." Learning to talk about ourselves, I mean. Maybe. The conversation drifted to safer topics: favorite neighborhoods, places to eat, the eternal Seattle debate over whether the city was losing its soul to tech money. But underneath the casual chatter, I could feel something building between us. Not attraction exactly, though there was definitely an element of that. More like recognition. Two people who'd been walking around with the same wound, suddenly finding themselves in the presence of someone who understood the weight of carrying it alone. When we finally left the coffee shop, the afternoon light was already fading. October in Seattle meant darkness came early, the city settling into its winter hibernation mode. We walked slowly in the direction of our building, neither of us seeming eager to end the encounter. "Thank you," Finn said as we reached our street. "For the coffee." "For the conversation." "Thank you for untangling my headphones." "Any time." He paused at the building entrance, key in hand. Would you maybe want to do this again? Coffee, I mean?" The question was asked with careful casualness, but I could hear the vulnerability underneath. The fear of rejection, of misreading the situation. I knew because I felt the same uncertainty. "Yes," I said, probably too quickly. "I'd like that." Finn's smile was radiant, transforming his entire face. "Saturday afternoon? There's this place on Broadway I've been wanting to try." "It's a date." The words slipped out before I could stop them, and I felt my face burn with embarrassment. "I mean—" "I know what you meant," Finn said softly. "And yes, it is." Saturday couldn't come fast enough, and when it finally did, I spent an embarrassing amount of time choosing what to wear. Everything in my closet seemed wrong, too formal, too casual, too obviously like I was trying too hard. I finally settled on dark jeans and a gray sweater that my sister had bought me last Christmas, claiming it brought out my eyes. The cafe on Broadway was a revelation. Unlike the trying too hard place on Pike Street, this one felt genuinely organic. Worn wooden floors, mismatched ceramic mugs, the kind of comfortable shabbiness that couldn't be manufactured. Finn was already there when I arrived, sitting at a corner table with a book open in front of him. "What are you reading?" I asked, sliding into the opposite chair. He held up the cover, a thick volume about marine ecosystems. "Light weekend reading." "Of course it is." This time, the conversation flowed more easily. Maybe it was the more intimate setting, or maybe we'd gotten past the initial awkwardness of two introverts trying to navigate social interaction. Finn told me about his research, his voice becoming animated as he described the complex relationships between different species, the delicate balance that kept underwater ecosystems functioning. I found myself genuinely fascinated, not just by the subject matter, but by the passion in his voice when he talked about his work. "You really love it," I observed. "It's one of the few things that makes sense to me," he said. "Underwater, everything has its place, its purpose. There's beauty in that kind of order." "And on land?" Finn's expression grew thoughtful. "On land, things are messier. People are messier." "Is that why you spend so much time on research boats?" "Partly." He traced the rim of his mug with one finger. "It's easier to be alone than to risk getting hurt again." The admission hung between us, heavy with implication. I wanted to ask about what had hurt him, who had left him so wary of human connection, but I recognized the careful way he'd phrased it, the same protective language I used when skirting around my own damaged places. "I understand that," I said instead. "Do you?" I nodded. "My last relationship, it didn't end well. Made me realize I'm better at being alone than I am at being with someone." "What happened?" The question was gentle without any pressure behind it. I found myself telling him about David, about the slow erosion of my sense of self, the way jealousy and control had been disguised as love until I almost believed it myself. I told him about the fights, the isolation from friends, the way I'd started to doubt my own perceptions of reality. It was more than I'd shared with anyone in the 2 years since the breakup, but something about Finn's presence made it feel safe. "He sounds like a nightmare," Finn said when I finished. He wasn't always. At the beginning, he was charming, attentive, made me feel like I was the center of his universe. Until you realized he wanted you to be his entire universe. Exactly. I looked at him curiously. You sound like you know something about that. Finn's jaw tightened slightly. My ex was possessive, emotionally manipulative, had a way of making me feel like I was crazy for wanting basic things like time with friends or privacy. How long were you together? 3 years, far longer than I should have been. He met my eyes. It's strange, isn't it? How easy it is to lose yourself in someone else's idea of who you should be. We sat in comfortable silence for a moment, both of us processing the weight of what we'd shared. Around us, the cafe hummed with quiet conversation and the hiss of the espresso machine. But it felt like we were in our own private world. "Can I ask you something?" Finn said finally. "Sure." "The piano playing at night. Is it because of all that? The insomnia, I mean?" I nodded slowly. "Music is the only thing that quiets my mind when everything else is too loud." "What do you play?" "Everything. Classical, jazz, some contemporary stuff. Whatever fits my mood." "Would you—" Finn hesitated, then seemed to gather his courage. "Would you maybe play something for me sometime?" The request was so unexpected, so intimate that I felt my breath catch. Playing for an audience, even an audience of one, felt terrifyingly vulnerable. But the way Finn was looking at me, with genuine interest rather than casual curiosity, made me want to say yes. "Maybe," I said. "If you're sure you want to hear it." "I'm sure." The next few weeks fell into a pattern that felt both natural and surreal. Coffee dates became dinner dates, became long walks through the city, exploring neighborhoods neither of us had bothered with before. Finn showed me hidden corners of Seattle I'd never noticed, a tiny bookstore tucked behind a vintage clothing shop, a viewpoint in Myrtle Edwards Park where you could watch the ferries cross Elliott Bay, a late-night diner in Fremont that served the best pie in the city. In return, I shared my own discoveries, the Capitol Hill Library branch that stayed open until midnight, a record store in the U District where you could still find vinyl treasures, the exact bench in Volunteer Park where the morning light hit perfectly on clear days. We were both solitary creatures by nature, but somehow being alone together felt different from being alone alone. The physical attraction was undeniable but unspoken, hanging between us like a held breath. Accidental touches when reaching for the same book, standing close enough on crowded sidewalks to catch his scent, something clean and woodsy that made me want to lean closer. Sometimes I'd catch him looking at me with an expression I couldn't quite read, something soft and wondering that made my heart race. But we were both careful, both carrying too much baggage to rush into anything physical. Instead, we built intimacy through conversation, through shared silence, through the gradual lowering of walls that had taken years to construct. One evening in early November, as we walked along the waterfront watching the sunset paint Puget Sound in shades of gold and pink, Finn stopped suddenly. "What is it?" I asked. He was staring at the water, his expression distant. "I had a panic attack on this pier once, about a month after I moved here. The admission was so unexpected that I wasn't sure how to respond." "What happened?" "I don't know. I was just walking, trying to clear my head, and suddenly I couldn't breathe. Felt like I was drowning on dry land." He laughed bitterly. "Ironic, considering how much time I spend underwater. Have you talked to someone about it? A therapist?" Finn nodded. "Started seeing someone in Austin after my ex and I broke up. Found someone here when I moved. It helps, mostly." "What triggered it that day?" "Loneliness, I think. The weight of starting over in a new city, not knowing anyone. Realizing that I'd become so good at being alone that I'd forgotten how to be anything else." He looked at me then, his eyes searching. "I don't feel that way anymore." "Lonely, I mean." My heart clenched at the vulnerability in his voice. Without thinking, I reached out and took his hand. His fingers intertwined with mine, warm and steady. "Neither do I," said quietly. We stood there for a long moment, holding hands as the city lights began to flicker on around us. The silence between us was charged with possibility, with the recognition that we were both standing at the edge of something that could either heal us or break us completely. "Liam," Finn said softly. "Yeah?" He turned to face me fully, his free hand coming up to brush against my cheek. The touch was feather light, questioning. "Can I kiss you?" My breath caught. This was the moment I'd been both hoping for and dreading. The point where we'd have to decide whether to take the risk of letting someone close again. But looking into Finn's eyes, seeing the same mixture of want and fear that I felt, the answer was surprisingly easy. "Yes," I whispered. He leaned in slowly, giving me every opportunity to change my mind. When our lips finally met, it was soft and tentative, more question than statement. But when I kissed him back, something shifted between us. The careful walls we'd both maintained began to crack, letting in possibility and hope and the terrifying prospect of not having to be alone anymore. When we broke apart, we stayed close, foreheads touching, breathing the same air. "Well," Finn said, his voice slightly unsteady. "That was worth the wait?" "Definitely worth the wait." The kiss changed everything and nothing. We were still careful with each other, still mindful of the wounds we both carried. But there was a new intimacy between us, a recognition that we were no longer just two lonely people who'd found each other by accident. We were choosing to be together, despite the risks. Our dates became more frequent, more domestic. Finn would come over on Sunday mornings with coffee and pastries from the French bakery on Pine Street, and we'd sit at my small kitchen table reading different sections of the newspaper. I started cooking dinner for him on Tuesday nights, simple meals that we'd eat while watching old movies on my laptop. He introduced me to documentaries about ocean life. I showed him foreign films with subtitles that made him squint at the screen. Slowly, we began to reveal more of ourselves. Finn told me about growing up in small-town Texas, the son of a Baptist minister who'd struggled to accept his sexuality. I shared stories about my own coming-out journey, the slow acceptance from my family, the lingering sense that I'd disappointed them in some fundamental way. We talked about our exes more openly, comparing war stories with the dark humor of survivors. Finn's ex, Marcus, had been charming and successful on the surface, but gradually revealed himself to be controlling and emotionally abusive. He'd isolated Finn from his friends, monitored his phone calls, made him feel like he was crazy for wanting basic autonomy. The final straw had come when Marcus had shown up at Finn's workplace during a conference, creating a scene that left Finn humiliated and jobless. "That's when I knew I had to leave," Finn said. "Not just him, but Austin entirely. I couldn't rebuild my life in a place where he might show up at any moment." I understood the need for geographical distance from trauma. My own relationship with David had ended 2 years ago, but I still occasionally saw him around Capitol Hill, still felt that familiar spike of anxiety when I spotted his distinctive red jacket in a crowd. "Do you think we're broken?" I asked one evening as we lay on my couch, Finn's head on my shoulder, both of us drowsy from wine and conversation. "What do you mean?" "All this baggage we're carrying." The way we both flinch at loud voices, get nervous when the other person doesn't text back immediately. "Are we too damaged for this to work?" Finn was quiet for a long moment, his fingers tracing patterns on my chest. "I think everyone's broken in some way," he said finally. "The question is whether you find someone whose broken places fit with yours." "And do you think ours fit?" He lifted his head to look at me, his expression serious. "I think we're both learning how to trust again." That's not broken. That's brave. The first time Finn stayed overnight, it was entirely unplanned. We'd been watching a movie marathon, his choice, a series of documentaries about coral reefs that were far more engaging than I'd expected, when I dozed off on the couch. I woke up around 2 a.m. to find him still awake, reading on his phone with the volume turned down low. "You should go to bed," he said softly when he noticed I was stirring. "What time is it?" "Late. I should probably head home," but neither of us moved. The idea of him leaving, of returning to our separate apartments and separate beds, felt suddenly unbearable. We'd been building toward this moment for weeks, but neither of us had been brave enough to name it. "You could stay," I said, the words coming out in a rush before I lost my nerve. "If you want. I mean, it's late and—" "Are you sure?" The question was loaded with more than just concern about logistics. We both knew that staying the night would shift our relationship into new territory, would require a level of trust and vulnerability that we'd been carefully building toward, but hadn't quite reached. "I'm sure," I said. "But just sleeping. If that's okay." Finn's smile was soft and understanding. "Just sleeping sounds perfect." I gave him a spare toothbrush and one of my t-shirts to sleep in, then lay awake for a long time listening to him move around my bathroom, brush his teeth, settle into the other side of my bed. The intimacy of it was overwhelming, having another person in my space, sharing my bed, even with careful distance between us. But when I finally fell asleep, it was the most peaceful rest I'd had in months. November blended into December, and Seattle settled into its winter rhythm. The days grew shorter, the rain more persistent, and the city took on that particular Pacific Northwest melancholy that could either inspire great art or deep depression, depending on your perspective. Finn and I had developed our own rhythm, too. Tuesday dinners at my place, Saturday coffee dates, long Sunday walks regardless of weather. We'd progressed to casual physical affection, holding hands in public, quick kisses hello and goodbye, falling asleep together on my couch during movie nights. But we hadn't pushed beyond that, both of us seemingly content to let physical intimacy develop at its own pace. The first real test of our relationship came on a rainy Thursday evening in mid-December. I'd had a particularly frustrating day at work, a project deadline moved up by 2 weeks, a client who couldn't decide what they wanted, the usual tech industry chaos that made me question my career choices. I'd texted Finn about it, expecting sympathy and maybe an offer to bring dinner. Instead, I got radio silence. By 8 p.m., I was starting to worry. By 9, I was spiraling into familiar patterns of anxiety and worst-case scenarios. Was he okay? Had I said something wrong? Was he having second thoughts about us? I'd worked myself into a full panic by the time my phone finally buzzed with a text. Sorry, had to stay late on the boat. Rough day. Can we rain check dinner? The relief was immediate and overwhelming, followed quickly by embarrassment at my own reaction. This was exactly the kind of anxious attachment behavior that had poisoned my relationship with David, the inability to give my partner space without assuming catastrophe. I texted back, "Of course. Everything okay?" His response came quickly. "Just tired. Talk tomorrow?" But something in the brevity of his messages nagged at me. Finn was usually more communicative, more detailed in his explanations. Was he really just tired, or was this the beginning of the slow fade that I'd experienced before? I spent the evening pacing my apartment, alternately composing and deleting text messages. By the time I finally went to bed, I'd convinced myself that I'd misread our entire relationship, that Finn was already pulling away. The next morning brought clarity and embarrassment in equal measure. Finn called before I was even fully awake, his voice rough with exhaustion. "I'm sorry about last night," he said without preamble. I was being weird. "You don't need to apologize for having a bad day." "It wasn't just a bad day." He paused, and I could hear him taking a deep breath. "We had an equipment failure on the boat, lost a day's worth of data, and my project manager basically blamed me for not having better backup protocols. It brought up a lot of stuff." "What kind of stuff?" "Marcus used to do that. Find ways to make everything my fault, even things that were completely out of my control. Yesterday, listening to my boss tear into me, I went to a dark place for a while. My heart clenched. Finn, I know it's not the same situation. I know my boss isn't Marcus, but in the moment it felt exactly the same, and I just shut down. I didn't want to bring that energy to you." The admission was so honest, so vulnerable that I felt ashamed of my own anxious spiral the night before. While I'd been worrying about whether he still liked me, he'd been struggling with trauma responses that I should have recognized and understood. "You can bring that energy to me," I said softly. "That's what this is for, isn't it? Being there for each other when things are hard? I'm still learning how to do that, how to let someone in when I'm falling apart." "We both are." There was a long pause. Then Finn said, "Can I come over tonight?" "I'll bring dinner." "You don't have to bring anything. Just bring yourself." When he arrived that evening, I could see the exhaustion in every line of his body. He looked like someone who'd been fighting battles all day and barely won. Without thinking, I pulled him into a hug, holding him tight until I felt some of the tension leave his shoulders. "Better?" I asked when we finally separated. "Much." He studied my face carefully. "Were you worried last night?" When I went quiet, there was no point in lying. "Yeah, I was." "What did you think?" "That you were having second thoughts. That I'd done something wrong. That you were starting to pull away." I felt heat rise in my cheeks. All the greatest hits of my anxiety playlist. Finn's expression was pained. "I'm sorry. I didn't think about how my silence might affect you. And I didn't think about what you might be going through. I just made it about me." I took his hands in mine. "We're going to have to get better at this. Communication, I mean." "Agreed." He squeezed my fingers. "For what it's worth, I'm not having second thoughts. About you. About us. Yesterday was just yesterday." "Good," I said, relief flooding through me. "Because I'm not either." That conversation marked a turning point in our relationship. We started being more deliberate about checking in with each other, about naming the anxious thoughts that might otherwise fester in silence. Finn began texting me when he was having difficult days, not to solve anything but just to let me know where his head was. I started sharing my own struggles with work stress and social anxiety, the way crowded spaces sometimes made me feel like I was suffocating. We developed our own language for these moments, code words for when one of us was struggling, signals for when we needed space or comfort or just acknowledgement. It was like learning to speak a new dialect of intimacy, one built on honesty rather than assumption. The physical side of our relationship evolved slowly too. We graduated from careful sleeping arrangements to actually cuddling, from quick kisses to longer, deeper ones that left us both breathless and wanting more. But we didn't rush toward sex, both of us seeming to understand instinctively that our emotional intimacy needed to develop first. Instead, we explored each other in smaller ways. I learned that Finn had a scar on his left shoulder from a diving accident in graduate school, that he was ticklish behind his ears, that he made small, contented noises when I ran my fingers through his hair. He discovered that I had a birthmark shaped like a crescent moon on my hip, that I was sensitive at the base of my neck, that I melted completely when he traced patterns on my back with his fingertips. These discoveries felt monumental, more intimate than sex had ever been with previous partners. Maybe because we were both so careful with each other, so deliberate in our exploration. Maybe because we understood that bodies, like hearts, required patience and trust to fully reveal themselves. One evening in late December, as we lay in my bed reading, him a research journal, me a novel I'd been working through for weeks, I looked over to find him watching me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "What?" I asked. "Nothing. Just." He reached out to touch my face gently. "I'm happy. That's all. It's been a long time since I could say that." "Me too," I said, and meant it completely. We were both quiet for a moment, the weight of that admission settling between us. Happiness felt dangerous when you'd spent so long protecting yourself from disappointment. But here we were, cautiously, tentatively happy. "Liam," Finn said softly. "Yeah?" "What are we doing for New Year's?" The question was casual, but I could hear the hope underneath it. The assumption that we'd spend it together, that we were planning a future that extended beyond the immediate moment. "I don't know," I said. "What do you want to do?" "Stay in. Order too much food. Watch the ball drop on TV and pretend we care about the countdown." That sounds perfect. And it did sound perfect. The idea of spending the last night of the year wrapped up with him, safe and warm while the rest of the world celebrated outside, felt like exactly the kind of quiet intimacy I'd been craving without knowing it. New Year's Eve arrived gray and drizzly, typical Seattle winter weather that made staying indoors feel like a gift rather than a compromise. Finn arrived at my apartment around 6 with bags of Thai food and a bottle of champagne that he claimed to have been saving for a special occasion. "Is this a special occasion?" I asked, taking the bottle from him. "First New Year's Eve in 5 years that I actually want to remember," he said. "I'd say that qualifies." We ate dinner on the couch, containers of pad thai and green curry spread across my coffee table, while old episodes of a nature documentary played in the background. The food was too spicy, and the champagne was too expensive for my usual budget, but everything felt perfect in its indulgence. As the evening progressed, we migrated from the couch to my bed, not for sex, but for the simple pleasure of lying close together, talking quietly about everything and nothing. Finn told me stories from his childhood, growing up in a town where everyone knew everyone else's business, the particular claustrophobia of being different in a place that demanded conformity. I shared memories of my own small-town upbringing, the way "You don't have to go yet, if you don't want to." The words hung in the air between us like smoke from a dying fire, visible and intangible at the same time. Alex's voice was so soft I might have imagined it, except for the way he was looking at me, vulnerable and hopeful and terrified all at once. The empty wine glasses sat forgotten on his coffee table, the remains of our chocolate growing warm in the heated apartment, and somewhere in the distance, I could hear the first fat drops of rain beginning to tap against his windows. I should have said something, Should have laughed it off, made some joke about it being a work night, thanked him for dinner, and made my graceful exit back to the safety of my own apartment just 30 feet away. Instead, I found myself frozen on his couch, acutely aware of every sound, the soft hiss of his radiator, the distant hum of traffic on Lincoln Avenue, the way his breathing had gone slightly shallow while he waited for my response. "I don't want to," I heard myself say, the words emerging without conscious permission from my brain. "Go, I mean. I don't want to go." The relief that crossed Alex's face was so profound it made my chest ache. He nodded, as if confirming something to himself, then glanced toward the windows where the rain was picking up intensity, drumming against the glass with increasing urgency. "Good," he said simply. "I was hoping you'd say that." We sat there for a moment, neither of us quite sure how to navigate this new territory we'd stumbled into. The air felt charged with possibility and weighted with everything we weren't saying. I could smell his cologne, something subtle and woody that seemed to cling to his sweater, and I was suddenly, painfully aware of how close we were sitting, how easy it would be to close the distance between us. "More wine?" Alex asked, though both our glasses were still half full. "Sure," I said, because it gave us something to do with our hands, some excuse for the nervous energy that was crackling between us like static electricity. Alex refilled our glasses, his movements careful and precise, and I watched the way his fingers curved around the bottle, the way the tendons in his wrists shifted as he poured. Everything about him seemed suddenly hyper-real, like someone had adjusted the contrast on my vision. "Julian," he said, as he settled back onto the couch, and there was something different in the way he said my name. Softer, more intimate, like he was testing how it felt in his mouth. "Yeah? I'm glad you moved in across the hall." The simplicity of the statement hit me harder than any elaborate declaration could have. I felt something shift in my chest, some careful wall I'd spent years building beginning to crack. "Me too," I said, and meant it more than I'd meant anything in a long time. Outside, the rain intensified, transforming from tentative drops to a steady downpour that created a cocoon of sound around us. It was the kind of rain that made the whole world feel smaller, more intimate, like we were the only two people left in Chicago. "Can I ask you something?" Alex said, turning slightly on the couch so he was facing me more directly. "Earlier, when you started to explain why you don't put yourself out there much, you looked like you wanted to say more." I took a sip of wine, using the time to gather my thoughts. There was something about the rain, the wine, the way Alex was looking at me with such careful attention that made honesty feel not just possible, but necessary. "I was in a relationship a few years ago," I said slowly, the words feeling rusty in my mouth. "Someone I thought I was going to spend my life with. David. We were together for almost 3 years. Alex nodded, not interrupting, just listening with the kind of focused attention that made me want to keep talking. "It started out wonderful. He was charming, successful, everything I thought I wanted. But gradually..." I paused, trying to find the right words. "He had very specific ideas about who I should be, what I should want, how I should spend my time. When I'd get gigs he didn't approve of, he'd find reasons I shouldn't take them. When I'd make plans with friends, suddenly we'd have conflicts he'd forgotten to mention." I could feel Alex's attention intensify, the way the quality of his listening changed when he recognized something familiar in my words. It was subtle at first. So subtle that I convinced myself I was being oversensitive, that he was just trying to help me make better decisions. But by the end, I barely recognized myself. I was so focused on anticipating his moods, avoiding his criticism, that I'd forgotten what my own opinions were about anything. "How did you finally leave?" Alex's voice was gentle, carefully neutral. He made the mistake of criticizing my piano playing in front of other people. Told everyone at a dinner party that I was just a lounge act and should consider finding something more stable. I laughed,
but there was no humor in it. Music was the one thing I'd never let him touch, and hearing him dismiss it like that in front of strangers, it was like a switch flipped.
I saw him clearly for the first time in months. Alex was quiet for a long moment, turning his wine glass slowly in his hands. "How long ago?" he asked finally. 2 years. A little more than 2 years. I looked over at him, studying his profile in the soft light from his table lamp. "What about you?" "You seem like someone who understands controlling relationships." Alex's smile was rueful. "That obvious, huh?" "Just a feeling." He was quiet for so long I started to think he wasn't going to answer. Outside, the rain continued its steady percussion against the windows, and somewhere in the building, I could hear the faint sound of someone's television, the distant murmur of other people's lives continuing around us. "His name was Marcus," Alex said finally. "We were together for about 2 years, up until just before I moved here. Software engineer like me, which I thought was perfect at first. We understood each other's work, had similar schedules, could talk about technical problems together." Alex took a sip of wine, and I watched his throat work as he swallowed. "But Marcus had this way of making me feel like I was never quite good enough. My code wasn't elegant enough, my apartment wasn't organized enough, my friends weren't interesting enough. He never said it directly, just made suggestions, little corrections, always framed as trying to help me be better." "The worst kind," I said softly, recognizing the pattern. "Exactly." And because it was never overt, because he never raised his voice or called me names, it took me forever to understand that what was happening to me was actually manipulation. Alex's voice carried the weight of someone who'd spent a lot of time thinking about this, trying to parse the difference between love and control.
By the end, I was second-guessing every decision I made, every word that came out of my mouth. I felt like I was walking on eggshells in my own life. "What finally made you realize?" He started monitoring my computer usage. Said it was to help me be more productive, but really he was checking what websites I visited, who I talked to online, how I spent my time when he wasn't around. Alex shook his head. "When I found the software he'd installed, when I realized he'd been doing it for months without telling me, that's when I understood that what I thought was love was actually surveillance." We sat with that revelation for a moment, the weight of shared understanding settling between us. There was something both devastating and comforting about recognizing your own experience reflected in someone else's story, about realizing you weren't alone in the particular kind of damage that controlling relationships could inflict. "Is that why you moved to Chicago?" I asked. "Partly. I needed to be somewhere he couldn't just show up, couldn't accidentally run into me at places he knew I liked to go. But also—" Alex paused, seeming to search for the right words. "I needed to be somewhere I could figure out who I was without his voice in my head, telling me what I should think about everything." "And have you? Figured it out, I mean?" Alex looked at me then, really looked at me, and I felt something electric pass between us. "I'm starting to," he said quietly, "especially lately." The implication in his words made my stomach flutter with something that felt dangerously close to hope. I took another sip of wine, trying to steady myself, but the alcohol only seemed to make everything more intense. The sound of the rain, the warmth of Alex's presence beside me, the way the soft light made his eyes look almost golden. "Julian," Alex said, and there was something different in his voice now, something that made me look up from my wine glass to meet his gaze. "Can I tell you something?" "Of course." "The first night I heard you playing piano, I stood by our shared wall for almost an hour just listening. Not because I was trying to eavesdrop, but because—" He trailed off, running a hand through his already disheveled hair. "Because it was the first time since I'd moved here that I felt like I wasn't completely alone." The confession hit me like a physical blow, stealing the breath from my lungs. I set down my wine glass with unsteady hands, not trusting myself to hold it. "Alex," I started, but he held up a hand. Let me finish. Please. His voice was soft but urgent, like he needed to get this out before he lost his nerve. I know we barely know each other. I know this is probably too much, too fast. But there's something about you that makes me feel safe. Like I can be myself without worrying about judgment or criticism or having to perform some version of who I think you want me to be. I felt tears prick at the corners of my eyes, completely unexpected and overwhelming. When was the last time someone had made me feel safe? When was the last time I'd even thought to want that? You make me feel that way too, I whispered, the words barely audible above the sound of rain against glass. Alex's eyes widened slightly, like he hadn't expected me to reciprocate, hadn't dared to hope that what he was feeling might be mutual. We looked at each other across the small space between us on his couch, and I felt the air change, becoming charged with possibility and want, and something that felt almost too fragile to acknowledge. I keep thinking I'm imagining this, Alex said, his voice so low I had to lean closer to hear him. This connection between us. Like maybe I'm just projecting what I want to feel onto a situation that's actually perfectly ordinary. You're not imagining it, I said, and as the words left my mouth, I realized how true they were. This thing between us, whatever it was, felt as real and substantial as the rain drumming against his windows. I feel it too. Something shifted in Alex's expression then, some last wall of uncertainty crumbling away. He reached across the space between us, slowly, giving me every opportunity to pull back, and when I didn't, his fingers found mine where they rested on my thigh. The contact was electric, sending warmth shooting up my arm and straight to my chest. His skin was warm and slightly rough, his touch gentle but sure, and I found myself marveling at such a simple connection. Our fingers interlaced, his thumb tracing small circles across my knuckles. Is this okay? He asked, and I could hear the vulnerability in the question. Yes, I breathed, and meant it more than I'd ever meant anything. We sat like that for a while, holding hands like teenagers, neither of us wanting to push for more, but both reluctant to break the connection. The rain continued its steady rhythm outside, creating a kind of temporal bubble around us where the outside world ceased to exist, and there was only this. Alex's fingers warm between mine, the soft sound of our breathing, the way the lamplight caught the gold flecks in his eyes. I should probably tell you, Alex said eventually, his voice barely above a whisper. I haven't done this in a while. Done what? Any of this. Holding hands with someone. Feeling. He paused, searching for the right word. Hopeful about another person. How long is a while? Since before Marcus. Since before I understood what it felt like to have someone try to control every aspect of your life. Alex's thumb was still tracing those small circles across my hand, the movement unconscious and soothing. I keep waiting for the other shoe to drop, for you to start telling me all the ways I should be different. I won't do that, I said with more certainty than I felt about anything else in my life. I promise I won't do that to you. I know, Alex said, and the simple trust in his voice made my chest tight with emotion. That's what scares me and thrills me at the same time. I understood exactly what he meant. There was something terrifying about allowing yourself to be vulnerable with another person, about lowering the careful defenses you'd spent years constructing. But there was also something intoxicating about it, about the possibility of being truly seen and accepted by someone else. Can I ask you something? I said. Anything. What do you want? I mean, right now in this moment, what do you want? Alex was quiet for so long I started to worry I'd pushed too hard, asked for more honesty than he was ready to give. But when he finally spoke, his voice was steady and sure. I want to kiss you, he said simply. I've wanted to kiss you since our coffee date, maybe since that first night in the hallway when you were untangling your headphones and looking at me like you couldn't quite believe I was real.
The confession hit me like lightning, sending heat racing through my entire body. I looked at Alex, really looked at him, taking in the way his eyes had gone dark with want, the way his free hand was clenched in his lap like he was physically restraining himself, the way his breathing had gone slightly shallow. "Then why don't you?" I whispered. For a moment, Alex just stared at me, like he was trying to determine if I was serious. Then, slowly, carefully, he reached up with his free hand to cup my cheek. His palm was warm against my skin, his thumb brushing across my cheekbone with infinite gentleness. "Are you sure?" he asked, and I could hear years of hurt and caution in the question. Instead of answering with words, I leaned into his touch, closing the distance between us by inches. I could smell his cologne more strongly now, could see the fine lines around his eyes, the way his pupils had dilated in the low light. He was so close I could feel his breath against my lips, warm and wine-sweet. "Julian," he whispered, my name like a prayer in the quiet space between us. And then he was kissing me, soft and tentative at first, like he was afraid I might disappear if he moved too fast. His lips were warm and gentle, tasting of wine and chocolate, and something uniquely him that made my head spin. I kissed him back just as carefully, just as reverently, pouring all the loneliness and longing of the past 2 years into the connection between us. It was nothing like the desperate, consuming kisses I'd shared with David, where every touch had felt like a claim, a demand for possession. This was different, patient and exploratory, like we had all the time in the world to learn each other, like we were both determined to savor every second of this first taste of intimacy. When we finally broke apart, we stayed close, foreheads touching, sharing the same air. Alex's hand was still cupping my cheek, his thumb now tracing the line of my jaw with feather-light touches that made me shiver. "That was—" he started, then trailed off, apparently at a loss for words. "Perfect," I finished for him, and felt him smile against my forehead. I was going to say worth waiting for, but perfect works too. We settled back against the couch, still holding hands, both of us seemingly reluctant to break the physical connection we'd established. The rain outside had intensified even further, creating a wall of sound that made Alex's apartment feel like the safest, most intimate place in the world. "I should probably warn you," Alex said after a while, his voice soft in the lamplight. "I'm not very good at casual. When I care about someone, I care completely. It's probably one of the things that made me such an easy target for Marcus. I don't know how to hold back." "Good," I said, surprising myself with the vehemence in my voice. "I don't want you to hold back. I'm tired of everything being careful and measured and safe." Alex turned to look at me, his expression serious. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying I want this. Whatever this is, I want to see where it goes." I took a deep breath, gathering courage from some reservoir I hadn't known existed. "I'm saying I care about you too, completely, and it scares the hell out of me, but I don't want to run from it anymore. Even though we're neighbors? Even though if this goes badly, we'll still have to see each other every day in the hallway?" I thought about that for a moment, considering the practical implications of what we were contemplating. It was true that dating your across-the-hall neighbor was probably not the wisest decision from a logistical standpoint. But then I looked at Alex, really looked at him, taking in the hope and fear and naked vulnerability in his expression, and I realized that some risks were worth taking. "Especially because we're neighbors," I said, "because I get to see you every day. Because I can hear you moving around in your apartment and know you're just a few feet away. Because when I'm playing piano late at night, you're listening, and that makes me feel less alone than I've felt in years." Alex's smile was radiant, transforming his entire face with joy and relief. "In that case," he said, bringing our joined hands to his lips and pressing a soft kiss to my knuckles, "I should probably tell you that I've been falling for you since that first coffee date." "Just since then?" I teased, and Alex laughed.
Okay, fine. Since the headphone incident in the hallway. Maybe even since the first night I heard you playing piano and stood by the wall like a creepy neighbor listening to you practice scales. Not creepy, I said, shifting closer to him on the couch until our thighs were touching. Sweet. Romantic, even. Just wait until you hear about all the times I've timed my trips to get mail so they'd coincide with yours. You didn't. I absolutely did. Why do you think we kept running into each other by the mailboxes? I was laughing now, the sound feeling foreign in my throat after so many months of careful solitude. And here I thought it was just coincidence. There are no coincidences when it comes to attractive pianists who live across the hall, Alex said solemnly, then broke character and grinned. Though I have to admit, the tangled headphones thing was pure luck. I couldn't have orchestrated that if I'd tried. We talked for hours after that, curled together on Alex's couch while the rain continued its steady percussion outside. We talked about everything and nothing. Childhood embarrassments and college mistakes, favorite movies and books we were too ashamed to admit we'd read, the kinds of dreams we'd given up on, and the ones we were still secretly nurturing. I told Alex about the piece of music I'd been composing for months, but couldn't seem to finish, how it felt like trying to capture something that existed just beyond the edge of my consciousness. He told me about the novel he'd started writing in college and kept in a password-protected folder on his computer, too personal to share but too important to delete. "What's it about?" I asked, my head now resting on his shoulder, his arm warm and solid around me. "Two guys who meet in a coffee shop and fall in love over terrible poetry and good wine," Alex said, and I could hear the smile in his voice. "Very original, I know. Sounds perfect to me." As the night wore on, we found ourselves settling deeper into the couch, our bodies naturally arranging themselves into comfortable intimacy. Alex's fingers were playing with my hair, gentle touches that made me drowsy and content. The wine, the warmth, the steady sound of rain against glass, it all combined to create a cocoon of safety and belonging that I didn't want to leave. "Julian?" Alex said softly, and I could hear that he was getting sleepy too. "Hmm? Stay tonight. I mean, if you want to. It's still raining and it's late and—" He trailed off, uncertainty creeping back into his voice. "We don't have to do anything. I just don't want this to end yet." I lifted my head to look at him, taking in his tousled hair and sleepy eyes, the way his shirt had gotten rumpled from our cuddling. He looked younger like this, more vulnerable, and something in my chest clenched with affection so strong it was almost painful. "I'd like that," I said. "I'd really like that." Alex's smile was soft and relieved. "Good. I have an extra toothbrush and I can lend you something to sleep in." "Okay." But neither of us moved from the couch, both reluctant to break the spell that had settled over us. Outside, the rain showed no signs of letting up, creating a rhythm that seemed to match the steady beating of Alex's heart under my cheek. "Alex?" I said into the comfortable darkness. "Yeah? Thank you. For dinner, for tonight, for making me remember what it feels like to want something again." His arm tightened around me, and I felt him press a soft kiss to the top of my head. "Thank you for staying. For taking a chance on whatever this is." I could feel sleep pulling at the edges of my consciousness, the combination of wine and warmth and emotional exhaustion making my eyelids heavy. Alex's breathing was evening out too, becoming slower and deeper, and I realized we were both going to fall asleep right here on his couch, tangled together like we'd been doing this for years instead of hours. "Is this crazy?" I whispered into the darkness. "Probably," Alex murmured back, his voice thick with approaching sleep. "But maybe crazy is what we both need." The last thing I remembered before drifting off was the sound of rain against the windows, the warmth of Alex's body pressed against mine, and the strange, wonderful feeling of not being alone.
For the first time in over 2 years, I fell asleep feeling safe, wanted, and hopeful about what tomorrow might bring. When I woke, pale morning light was filtering through Alex's windows, and the rain had softened to a gentle patter. Alex was still asleep beside me, his face peaceful and unguarded in a way that made my chest tight with tenderness. His arm was still around me, holding me close even in sleep, like he was afraid I might disappear if he let go. I lay there for a long time, just watching him sleep and listening to the quiet sounds of the building waking up around us. Somewhere down the hall, Mrs. Chen was starting her morning routine. A car door slammed in the parking lot below, the ordinary sounds of life continuing, but everything felt different now, transformed by the intimacy we'd shared, by the promises we'd made in wine and darkness and rain. Alex stirred beside me, his eyes fluttering open slowly. When he saw me watching him, his face broke into a smile so radiant it made my breath catch. "Good morning," he said, his voice rough with sleep. "Good morning." We looked at each other for a long moment, both of us seeming to test whether the magic of the night before would survive the harsh light of day. But when Alex reached up to touch my cheek, when he looked at me with the same wonder and tenderness I'd seen the night before, I knew that whatever this was between us, it was real enough to last. "No regrets?" he asked softly, and I could hear the vulnerability behind the question. "None," I said, and meant it completely. "You?" "Only that we waited so long to do this." Alex's thumb brushed across my cheekbone, and I leaned into the touch automatically. I could get used to waking up like this. The implications of that statement hung in the air between us, full of possibility and promise, and the kind of future I hadn't dared to hope for in over 2 years. It was too soon to make promises, too early to know where this would lead, but sitting there in the gray morning light with Alex's arms around me, I felt something I'd almost forgotten existed. Hope. Outside, the rain continued its gentle rhythm, and somewhere in the building, life went on as it always had. But for us, everything had changed. We were no longer just two lonely people living across the hall from each other. We were something new, something fragile and precious and full of potential. And as Alex leaned down to kiss me good morning, soft and sweet and full of promise, I realized that sometimes the best things in life come not from grand gestures or dramatic moments, but from the quiet courage to open your heart to someone else, to take the risk of letting them see all your broken places and trust them not to cut themselves on the sharp edges. The future stretched out before us, uncertain and full of questions we didn't have answers for yet. But for now, in this moment, with rain pattering against the windows and Alex's arms around me and the whole day spread out before us like a blank canvas, it was enough to know that we were no longer facing whatever came next alone.